Thank you so much for 900,000 subscribers. That's amazing. I am incredibly grateful, and I look forward to answering your questions. So let's get started. My name is Joe Foley, and here are some solicited answers. Right, here we have a two-part question from Stormy Violet, and it is 1, how are you? And 2, what's the biggest misconception people have about you? So how am I? Yeah, I'm doing okay, actually. I've purposefully tried to readjust my work-life balance this year, and that's been good. That's been kind of generally good for me. I'm really enjoying doing the interviews. I want to do more of those because I always learn a lot from doing them. I kind of get to sit down and talk to these incredibly clever people. And actually, I'd be interested to know who you would like on, particularly. I'm often in on the lookout for academics that people are particularly fans of, or other people that kind of take your fancy. People that I might not have thought of or even necessarily heard of, but are kind of really interesting and have very interesting things to say. That's really cool. I want to have a guest on to talk about like French psychoanalysis. I think that'd be really cool, partly because it's something that I struggle so much with. So it would be like lovely to just have someone on, and it would in effect be a kind of live teaching session of them to me, and I can just ask them all the questions that I have about like Lacan, because Lacan is so difficult to understand. And I'd like to do more of that, bringing on people where actually they are an expert or otherwise very highly regarded in an area of philosophy or study that I personally find very difficult, and then I can just pepper them with my questions so that I understand it better, and then hopefully people might find that helpful as well, because I figure that whatever you struggle with, other people probably struggle with as well. I keep finding that whenever I mention that something is something that I find particularly difficult, people tend to resonate with that. I think partly because some things just are very difficult to understand. So if you find it difficult, chances are other people will be finding it difficult as well. So I'm really enjoying that, and I'd love to have more interviews on. I'm also just kind of enjoying the topics that I've been able to read about this year a lot. I'm really enjoying learning about the sophists, and I'm really enjoying learning a lot about the kind of philosophy of the internet stuff. A lot of my videos so far this year have been about the internet or internet discourse, but trying to, apply philosophy to it. And I've kind of stumbled across this subsection of the philosophical literature that is like the philosophy of the internet and of internet dynamics. And I think that's really good fun. I really want to do more of that because, the internet is one of the most revolutionary inventions ever. It's up there with like the printing press, and depending on how long humans are around for it, it might be up there with the wheel. So I know I'm quite interested in what philosophy has to say about that. So that's an area of philosophy that I found really interesting, and I'm really excited to read a bit more about that. So that's broadly how I'm doing. I also kind of like got my sleep schedule under control a bit more. Like I really prioritize sleep now. And I tell you what, I know this is really obvious, but it does wonders. It's so good. Like you will feel so much better if you get a good night's sleep, which, isn't particularly philosophically insightful, but I feel like it's one of those obvious life lessons, or obvious lessons, I suppose, that we kind of know is true and then we ignore. And I'm the same because I hate sleeping. I think sleeping is boring. It feels like missing out on like a third of life. But it does make the remaining 2/3 so much more pleasant. So that's been another thing that I've really kind of found has improved me this year. And then your second question, what's the biggest misconception people have about you? I don't know. I don't know to what extent people conceive about me. So I don't know what misconceptions can arise. I think sometimes people do give me a bit too much credit for things. People, I get a lot of really lovely comments. That's really nice. But I think that people can sometimes overestimate either my intelligence or like, how well read I am. Like I spend a lot of my time reading, but ultimately I'm 26 and I've only just turned 26. Like there's a limit to the extent of knowledge that I can have acquired. And I expect that I will look back on my time now and think, God, Joe, you knew like bugger all. And hopefully I'll think of myself as terribly misguided. So yeah, I don't know. I think that, people are very, very kind. And I think in some ways they're probably a bit too kind. I very occasionally get really, really lovely comments being like, "Oh, Joe, you're like really clever." And actually, like, I'm not being. This isn't like false modesty. I'm not like overly clever. When I was at university, there are plenty of people who were so much cleverer than I was. And I kind of want to get that across. I sometimes feel like, when we encounter people who are more knowledgeable at something or better at something than we happen to be at that point, there is a tendency to think that there must be something about that person that is special and separates them from me. I've always had a kind of tendency towards reading, and I've always had a tendency towards philosophy, but I wasn't like a prodigy or anything like that. There is nothing that I have learnt that I think, like other people couldn't. And so I don't know, maybe that's a misconception. I'm actually not that clever. I've just spent a fair amount of time on things, and even then I've still got so much more time to spend on them. So I know that will be a misconception, I would say. Okay, here we have a question from Digop2918, and it reads, if you had not studied philosophy, is there another subject that would interest you? So the most obvious one is maths. Like, I love maths. In fact, I want to do more of it now. It's been a long time since I've been able to sit down and devote a significant amount of time to familiarizing myself with a particular area of mathematics, or just going over stuff that I knew at one point, but has drifted out of awareness. Maths is one of those areas of study where if you don't use it, you lose it very quickly. And although it is easier to relearn something when you've learned it once, things just go, right? I used to be so much better at like abstract algebra than I am now. I used to, have a little textbook that I would kind of go through for fun, just an undergrad textbook, like nothing particularly major. And I'd like to do more of that. The channel keeps me very busy, and other projects keep me very busy. So I haven't had the chance to do that so much now, but that's an area that I would really like to have studied. And I still think that at some point I want to go do like a part-time degree level mathematics course. I think that'd be really good fun. I think I'd really enjoy it. There are a couple of other subjects that I kind of thought about applying for at university, and I'd still love to learn more about. One is linguistics. My third year undergrad dissertation was actually kind of half in philosophy, half in cognitive linguistics. So I always love learning about cognitive linguistics. And I think that philosophy of language would be a lot richer if more people spent time in cognitive linguistics. Because, I don't know, I think that doing philosophy of language in certain respects without doing cognitive linguistics, or without looking at cognitive linguistics, is a little bit like doing philosophy of mind without looking at neuroscience or psychology or any kind of empirical study of the mind. And I think most philosophers of mind will say those empirical results are relevant. And I think that in many ways, we could do with a kind of similar attitude in philosophy of language, where it's seen as continuous with and inseparable from cognitive linguistics. So that would be an area that I'd like to look more into. And I did genuinely think about applying for a degree in linguistics rather than philosophy. And I didn't in the end, but I could have easily have done. It was kind of on a knife's edge. And the other area, or the other subject that I think I'm very, very interested in is history, and particularly the history of ideas. A lot of the stuff that I've read this year has ended up being kind of histories of concepts, which has been really, really good fun. Like reception literature of various thinkers and how views of their thinking has evolved over time. Or alternatively, just histories of words. One of my favorite books I've read so far this year is The Making of Modern Cynicism. And that was like a history of the word cynic. And I think that was very, very cool. I really enjoyed it. So I'd like to read more of those going forward. I've read a fair few this year, but it's kind of seized me a bit, this kind of history of ideas, and particularly taking these terms that still have applications today and seeing how they evolved over time. So that's something that I'm really interested in. But I think maths is like that. That's the one that I would have gone for if I hadn't done philosophy. And I would still like to kind of go for at some point. I kind of think that, you kind of have thought experiments of, well, not thought experiments, just kind of daydreaming imaginings of what you would do if you suddenly £1 billion was deposited on your lap. And I think what I basically do is just go from university to university doing various different undergraduate degrees and master's degrees. And I think I'd find that really, really good fun. So yeah, there'd be all sorts of things that if I had kind of infinite time and infinite resources that I would love to go and study. But yeah, math would be the main one. Right, here we have a question from Rakenama. And it reads, do you have any hobbies that aren't so intertwined to philosophy? If so, what? Now, there is a reply to this that points out that everything is, of course, intertwined with philosophy. And yeah, like, I kind of would agree with that. But I also know what this person's getting at. I really like going to the gym. I spend, 4 or 5 evenings a week. Not the whole evening, Christ, but, fair portion of the evening there, which I think is great. It's just so good to, like, blow off steam. And I kind of think that getting in some physical exercise, it's a bit like the sleep thing we were talking about earlier, right? It sounds so obvious, but it's also very easy to listen to that and go, yeah, like, sure, man, and then not do it. But getting out some physical exertion, especially if, like me, your job might be mainly kind of either desk work or either like sedentary work, sitting work, staying still work. I think that making sure that you get some exercise in whatever form, I think is very worthwhile, not just for the physical benefits, but also just helps you think clearer, stops you from feeling like shit in the evenings. I think there's a limit to how happy you can be without moving, and so that's why I found the gym like really worthwhile. I'm not like super serious about it, but it does keep me sane. And then other hobbies. I used to be really into choral singing. I did that a lot at university. I don't do that so much anymore now. I ought to. There's a cathedral near me. And I have sung there before, so maybe I'll sign up with them. And singing more generally, I think is very cool. My family's sort of relatively musical. My dad plays a few instruments. My mum plays guitar, and my sister is a professional singer. She's on the West End at the moment. So I'm a bit musical, but I'm like the least musical member of my family. So I suppose I don't really think of myself as particularly musical. But that's something I kind of spend my time thinking about or doing. I like the history of music. I like looking into different composers. I used to have this kind of history of opera and a history of ballet that I used to enjoy dipping into. And I kind of think that it's nice to have that. Obviously, there are connections between music and philosophy, most famously in the work of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, or most recently, I suppose. Obviously, there's lots of treatments of music and musical aesthetics throughout philosophical history, but those are the ones that at least spring to my mind. So yeah, they are intertwined with philosophy, I suppose, but that's not the angle through which I approach them. So yeah, those would be two things that I do outside of philosophy that bring me a lot of fulfillment. Here we have a question from Rodia T4Z, and it reads, as a child, what did you want to be when you grew up? I went through many different stages. I wanted to be a physicist when I was very, very little, or a scientist of some sort. Then I wanted to kind of travel the world and kind of learn different languages, which is kind of rubbish. I'm like terrible at languages. I've not been able to learn one. I'd really like to learn German, but I'm awful at it, and I also don't spend enough time doing it. So really, when I say I'm awful at it, that's an excuse. What I mean is that I'm lazy, and I have not yet found myself insufficient discipline to sit down and learn German, which I don't think that it's like a kind of genetic inability. I just think that I struggle with motivation now, by which I mean I'm a bit lazy there. But I went through lots of different phases. I wanted to be a historian at some point. At uni, I kind of went through various different ideas of what I wanted to be. At one point, I wanted to be an actor, which was never going to work. And then, while I was at university, I wanted to be an academic, and I kind of still do in a way. Originally, the channel was kind of started, and what I was going to do is take a few years off in between my masters and then apply for PhDs, and I may still do that. It's just that this kind of side project that I was doing, so that I could continue to learn a bit of philosophy and read a bit in my spare time, has ballooned into what is now my absolutely wonderful job. So there is that. I would still like to go back and do my PhD at some point. I'd like to do it in philosophy of science. A lot of people have asked me if I have plans to do a PhD, and I would do. I'd like to do a PhD in pragmatist philosophy of science, and possibly connecting that with the comments that Nietzsche makes specifically in his very, very late unpublished work, and also in Twilight of the Idols. Because I think there's some really, really rich, what I would call pragmatist philosophy of science there, although the label there will probably be disputed. But I think there's a lot there that is incredibly relevant to modern philosophy of science, and I'd love to bring that out a bit. So yeah, that's kind of, maybe I'll end up doing a PhD in that. That'd be great. But yeah, that's a kind of general list of things that I wanted to be when I grew up as a child. I feel like in some ways, I don't think that kind of childhood dreams are totally discontinuous with adult dreams. I still have ideas of what I want to be when I grow up. It's just that, I sort of am grown up, but also there is clearly more growing to do. So I don't know. What do I want to be when I grow up now? I know. To be honest, I just want to write. I love writing. I think it's great. In any capacity, I would love to still be writing. And yeah, I don't know. That is what I do now. So I suppose that's absolutely fantastic. But I would like to continue doing it. So that's what I want to be when I grow up. Here's a question from Polyphonic Princess, and it reads, why do you think emotional sincerity is so often perceived as embarrassing or uncomfortable? And do irony and detachment play a role in that? So I've spoken about this, or I've mentioned this a couple of times on the channel. I effectively think that being ironic or being insincere and not having to commit to a position in a conversation just is a more powerful position to be in than being sincere or emotionally vulnerable or just saying what you think, right? I'm not saying that I'm extending this beyond, blubbering on camera or anything like that. I literally just mean giving your honest opinion on something. And the reason for this, I think, is basically that if you're being ironic or detached or in some way distancing yourself from the things that you're saying, which we all do at some point, and sometimes it's entirely appropriate, you don't have to stand by your words. You can then later say, oh, that's not what I think. I was just taking up that position. And sometimes that's really, really helpful, right? Sometimes that's exactly what you want. Quite often, if I'm interviewing someone and I want to press them on a particular position, I'll say, look, this isn't what I think. But this is the obvious objection to what you've just said. So could we delve into that a little bit more? But the trouble with the way that I think discourse occurs online is because so much of it is anonymous and because so much of it is happens between total strangers who might never see one another again. The glory of winning that particular outcome becomes outsized in people's priorities. At least this is what I reckon, right? I haven't actually, I've looked into this a bit, but it's not like I have, diehard empirical evidence for this. But this is what I think. So if you're having lots of one-off interactions with people and the main aim of that is to win the interaction, well, then you are likely to have more success if you're being ironic, because then you can take any position that you want on any issue that happens to be under discussion. And the other person, if they're being sincere, just simply cannot do that, right? They are stuck defending their sincerely held belief because that's not going to change probably within the course of this conversation. So that's one factor or incentive pushing people, I think, towards the direction of irony and detachment. But the other thing is it just affords you so much more flexibility in the conversation. You can, on the fly, change what you say and what you, for the purposes of that conversation, think. So it's just a much more flexible debating posture. And again, if your goal is to win that debate, then you want to allow yourself within the context of the debate as much flexibility as you possibly can. So that's another reason. And I think that this leads to a slightly pernicious scenario whereby, because irony and detachment are so much more efficacious in conversation, that means that eventually sincerity kind of gets edged out. If you let a bunch of ironists and a bunch of people being sincere together in the wild, then the ironists are going to outcompete the sincere people and eventually just, make them shut up. And the sincere people will either have to switch tactics and turn slightly ironic themselves, or they will have to simply stop talking. And so I think that's one of the reasons why having discussions online is so difficult. It's because the incentives are all towards irony. And I think part of this is because the interactions are so fleeting. Because, if you're, say if you had a friend, right, who talked in the totally ironic and detached way that works very well for people online, you would eventually just go, that guy's a dick and I'm not going to spend time with him. It only works because the interactions aren't repeated. You're talking to one person 1 minute, you're talking to another person the next minute. And as a result, the benefits of sincerity, which are that people kind of know your character, they get an idea about you, they know what you believe, there's a relationship of trust that builds up, all that is basically impossible anyway if you're just having one-off interactions with strangers online. And so only the strengths of irony are left. And yeah, so that's kind of why I think that irony and detachment tend to edge out sincerity on online discussions, because I think that it's just a function of a mixture of anonymity, interactions between strangers, the particular strengths of irony, and the fact that these are often one-off interactions. So yeah, in terms of why emotional sincerity is so often perceived as embarrassing or uncomfortable, I think just kind of because it is, right? Like it's an element of your life that is most often displayed in private. And so when it's displayed in public, there's a certain amount of vulnerability that comes from that I think understandably can make people kind of cringe a bit, right? It's like when, it's like if you saw someone completely breaking down in public, there's a little bit of you that's like, oh God, like I really feel for you. And I don't just feel for you because you're clearly upset. I feel for you because this is a socially embarrassing situation for you to be in. So no, I feel like emotional sincerity in that extreme sense has always been a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit embarrassing. I think that online, it's just that even straightforward sincerity that isn't particularly emotionally, I don't want to say incontinent, but I'm going to say it anyway, like emotionally incontinent, also gets mocked. And I think that's because of all of the incentives that I've talked about before. Effectively, it just is more advantageous for you to be an ironist online. I think that's a shame, with the possible exception, to be fair, of people in my position, whereby, you see my face and you have kind of repeated para interactions with me. So I don't know. I think that actual creators, especially creators, like long-term creators, there's a possible exception to that. But even then, what you'll more often see, I think, is people jumping in and out of the ironic stance as it suits. Which I know, I think is like, I think there are strengths and weaknesses to this. I wish that the internet was, or I wish the internet could facilitate a little bit more sincere conversation. But at the same time, I think there is room for creative irony. And I don't want to lose sight of that. I have been very harsh on irony in the past. And it's not that I think that it's completely useless. It's more like I think that it is outsized at the moment, has an outsized role. I think similarly about things like critique. You'll notice that on the channel, I basically never do response video content. That's not because I have like a kind of inherent moral aversion to it or anything like that. And I have done it a couple of times, but mostly I don't. And that's normally because I don't like my content to be purely critiquing or purely critical, just because I think it's so much easier to criticize than to create. And so I don't know. And I think that means that we end up online with an outsized number of critics and a small number of people kind of attempting to originate things or be enthusiastic or teach about things. And so I'd rather be in that latter camp. Again, I think for a very similar reason, the kind of oversaturation of critique online, I think occurs for a very similar reason as the oversaturation of irony. It is much, much easier to take something that exists and point out flaws in it because there are always flaws in things. Like it's very, very easy to spot flaws in basically everything. And than it is to create something that is nonetheless imperfect and will require refinement, but is there. And it's not leeching its existence off of another thing. That's not to say that I think that criticism isn't important. I just think that because it is easier, that means that we have to be careful about it taking an outsized role, because you need people creating these imperfect things in order that they can be later refined. Okay, next we have a question from A Male Bolger 2454, and it reads, what is the line between a non-philosophic piece of literature, like, say, The Hobbit, and a work of literature that is philosophy, like, say, one of Dostoevsky's novels? Is it simply intent on the part of the author? Can any work of literature be used to create something of philosophic value? Oh, and by the way, I love your channel. You do great work. Oh, well, thank you very much. That's very kind. So I don't think it's a hard line. I think that it is a sliding scale. There is a trivial sense in which you could say all literature and all work and almost everything is philosophical, in basically the same way that you can kind of trivially say that all art is political. The reason that in both cases I find that kind of thing unhelpful is because if your statement applies to everything, then chances are it doesn't say very much. We talked about this in a video I did not too long ago about the phrase, all relationships are transactional. If your statement applies to every one of a thing, then by definition, your definition must be large enough that it cannot differentiate between elements of those things. So I'll use all art is political as a good example here. There's a trivial sense in which I think that's probably true. I think I've given this example before. Like, even if you were to take a cave painting, right? And I was actually reading something about this the other day. It was on a book about dehumanization. And the author was pointing out that in cave paintings, animals tend to be drawn naturalistically, whereas people tend to be drawn symbolically. And you can have political import there, right? You can say, Colin, we can learn something about the way that these people saw the human being as distinct from the animal. And, if you might say that, well, we can look at the particular pigments they used or the particular materials they used, and we can learn something about the society in which they existed. At the very least, we can say something like, well, they must have had enough leisure time and enough stability to think it was worth painting the cave painting. And also, they had the time to do it. That's not insignificant, and that is a political inference. I think the danger is where, somebody uses that kind of triviality, where you can draw political conclusions from basically any work of art, and basically kind of anything that humans do, because politics is effectively the stuff that happens when humans come together and interact with one another and create things in a social context. I think that the danger comes when we take a trivial observation like that and we try to say things like, we act as if all art is equally political, which I think is obviously not true. Because take something like George Orwell's 1984 or An Homage to Catalonia, right? These are two incredibly political works. They have direct, explicit political content. Now, I could say in this trivial sense that both those works and the cave painting are political. But of course, the devil's in the details, right? There is significantly more political argumentation and content in these Orwellian works and in, numerous other overtly political works. Like Dostoevsky's Demons is an overtly political work in many, many points, at least. So there's more political content in those works than there surely is in the cave painting. This, I think, suggests that in addition to this trivial way of using the word political, where we say all art is political, we also need to make kind of intra-artistic distinctions between how political works are, what their politics is, whether their politics is in the content or the mere existence of the work, etc., etc., etc. And I think that sometimes this can get a bit obtuse, right? Like when someone says online, I don't want my films to be political or something like that, I think that to reply with a triviality like all art is political is sort of to say like, it is to deliberately misunderstand what they're saying, or at the very least to not put much effort into understanding what they're saying. Because clearly, it seems to me that they're using the term political in a narrower sense than in the trivial sense whereby all art is political. So anyway, that's kind of a side tangent. I would effectively say that a similar thing holds here, right? All literature, and I would say all art and pretty much all statements are philosophical in a very, very broad sense of the word. However, the trouble with that designation is that it's basically unhelpful because evidently, there are works that have more philosophical content and works that have less philosophical content, right? On my desk, I have, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. This was actually a birthday present from a friend of mine. It's not the one that I've got all my notes in, because I didn't want to kind of ruin it because it's a bit sentimental. But this is my kind of gift, Crime and Punishment. And let me see what else I've got. Do I have any literature that I would say is like totally non-philosophical around me? So this is the trouble, almost all the literature that I look at is a bit philosophical. But let's say, I've got Crime and Punishment on one hand, and imagine that I've got a copy of The Hungry Little Caterpillar on the other. Is it Hungry Little Caterpillar? It might be Very Hungry Caterpillar or Very Hungry Little Caterpillar. I don't know how many adjectives there are. But anyway, if I was to hold those two up, you could say, well, there is philosophical content in this children's tale. It says something about the nature of life. Life needs food to sustain itself or something like that. I can't really remember the plot of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, so I'm just kind of going off the idea that he probably eats a lot. But clearly we could say that there is more philosophical content within Crime and Punishment. And I think that distinction is worth drawing. Like, I think that when we define terms so broadly that we can no longer make helpful intra-set distinctions between the members of things like literature and art, I think they become unhelpful. So basically, I'd say it's a sliding scale. I don't think that there is a hard line. At the same time, I think that there are works that are evidently more philosophical than others. And again, when I'm reading classic literature, I almost always find that there is a healthy amount of philosophical content in there. It's interesting that you use The Hobbit as your kind of non-philosophical work of literature, because I think there's quite a lot of philosophy in The Hobbit. at least as much as you get in any other children's book. And certainly there's a lot of philosophy in Tolkien more generally. So I don't know. I think that there is philosophical value in an awful lot of literature. At the same time, I think that there are works that are clearly more philosophical than others. Okay, our next question is from the Neptune Kid, and it reads, where are you at in the consciousness discussion? So my position on consciousness is that I think that I'm generally quite skeptical of any philosophical debate that attempts to get to fundamental reality, if that makes sense. This came up a bit in my conversation with Philip Goff, and I've since talked about this with Jack Symes on his show, though I don't think that's come out yet, where a lot of the discussion around consciousness is about what consciousness is at a fundamental level, like what it is in and of itself, separate from anything that it does, or anything we can perceive about it, or anything we can infer from it, or any way in which it seems to manifest observably. And I kind of don't know what we're talking about then, if that makes sense. If we're trying to ascertain the inner nature of consciousness, I suppose I just don't quite know what I mean by an inner nature. And so I suppose I kind of struggle to understand the discussion in the way that it's normally put. And I don't mean that flippantly. I have tried to understand, and most people seem to have no trouble with this. So maybe it is just a me thing. But I often would give the same reply to physicalists who are kind of saying, yeah, everything in the world is fundamentally physical. And I kind of think, well, is it separate from any kind of observation we make of these things, or ways that we can interact with things? It also is this extra thing called physical. I don't know if that makes that much sense either. And I think that a lot of the time when I talk to physicalists and when I talk to non-physicalists, they seem to be able to recognize this critique when it's applied to the other camp, but not their camp. It's not that unusual to see non-physicalists calling physicalism incoherent or confused. And it's not that unusual to see physicalists calling non-physicalism incoherent and confused. And both of them seem to think that the other is positing this kind of weird, mysterious thing that the other party can't make sense of. Everything is physical, everything is non-physical, everything is ideas. What do any of these really mean? And I just share that skepticism, but I kind of feel it with all of the positions. And I think this conversation can get a bit confused because quite a lot of the time I see the term physicalism, I see it used for naturalism, right? Methodological naturalism. The idea that when we are studying the mind, we should attempt to use scientific and empirical methods to do it. And I don't mind that. That sounds great, right? I think that using observation and then seeing what we can infer from observation is a very good way to study anything and a very good way to study the mind. I've got no issue with that. But I don't see why we need this extra bit where we say that everything is physical. I don't know. In the same way that I don't see why we need this extra bit saying that things are non-physical, in their essence. I'm just really skeptical of the way that this debate is often couched in terms of inner natures or essences of things. I just kind of get a bit confused. This came up in my discussion with Philip Goff, as I said, because he was saying things perfectly reasonable things. These are things that I hear people say a fair amount in these debates, which is what consciousness is just by experiencing it. And I kind of think, well, I can see things, I have experiences, and I can look at the contents of those experiences, I suppose. I can see that, I've got my light there and my camera there and my screen there, and that allows me to sort of make sure that I'm kind of staying roughly in the center of the frame. And I can see all of those things, but I can't see the inner nature of my experience. This sounds really flippant when I say it, but I just don't know which part of my experience is meant to be the inner nature bit. And I promise that I'm not being obtuse when I say that. I just kind of, it seems to me that a lot of non-physicalists say things like when you experience, you get an insight into the inner nature of consciousness. And I don't know where the inner nature is meant to be. Is the inner nature meant to be all of it, taken in totality? Is the inner nature meant to be a structural property? I'm just not entirely sure. And I have tried. I've really tried to suss out what I think people mean by this. And maybe it's just that they're having an experience that I don't have. And that's okay. It might just be that I'm kind of, in the same way that some people are colorblind, I am inner nature blind or what have you. But I think that if I were to ask many of you now who are convinced that they know the inner nature of their experience just by kind of reflecting on it, which part of your experience is the bit that justifies this inner nature inference, I suppose, is the kind of thing that I would ask. And I say, in addition, I'm not massively sure what describing the entire world, the kind of totality of facts or the totality of stuff we study as physical really does. Like, in addition to being observed or the subject of empirical inquiry or the subject of kind of reasoned reflection, it's also this extra thing called physical. I don't know, I don't really get that either. Which is why I wouldn't call myself a physicalist. The closest, I don't know, the closest in literature position that I have generally on this kind of thing would be called something like phenomenalism, which is a position sometimes ascribed to David Hume, where I'm quite skeptical about getting beyond like perception and into things like inner natures. I'm there's a line from Nietzsche where he talks about the Greeks staying boldly on the surface, and in some ways I really resonate with that. Like, there's a kind of not that I think that's particularly necessarily the sense in which Nietzsche meant it, but staying with what I can see and think about. And that, you know, it seems to me that when I am theorizing about physical objects, I'm carving up bits of my experience. And that sounds like it's going to be, you know, some kind of argument for idealism. But the only kind of idealism that would establish is a very trivial kind. It's just the kind that says you can only see things through the lens of your experience, which is, I don't know, like kind of big whoop. Like, I don't really know what follows from that. Certainly nothing about the inner essence of everything follows from that. When I say that I can't get beyond experience, I literally just mean that I am experiencing things and there's nothing that I am experiencing that isn't part of my experience. It's like a deeply trivial claim. I don't know. So I suppose maybe it's because I have quite pragmatist leanings. I just find that a lot of the questions about consciousness, I suspect either it's just that I'm struggling to understand them, or I think that they might be trying to get at something that, I don't know, seems like it can never be experienced and seems like it can never be kind of checked, if that makes sense. Like, two people, we can imagine two people, one of whom is a physicalist, another whom is an idealist, and they both make all of the same predictions about the world, but one of them has this extra thing, which is that everything is physical, and another one has this extra thing, which is that everything is an idea in this kind of broad sense in which we can talk about ideas and idealism, because that can be a bit of a misleading way of putting it, but I'm going to stick with it for now. I just don't know what the extra bit's doing. It seems like these two things, if they're not totally equivalent, are equivalent in an awful lot of ways. And if this extra designation as physical or non-physical doesn't allow me to infer anything, and I can't perceive it, well, then I don't really know how I'm going to adjudicate this debate. And I also am not entirely convinced on what hangs on this. That's my position on the consciousness thing, which is why I kind of, you know, I had Walter White on, and I really enjoyed our discussion about consciousness, partly because I think that we focused a lot on kind of questions of how consciousness might have come about, what evolutionary role consciousness has, and I'm really interested in those sorts of questions. I'm less interested in thinking about what consciousness fundamentally is, or what anything fundamentally is, separate from any kind of experience of it or thoughts about it. Like, I mean, I've occasionally put it like this, which is, you know, I don't know what something seen from nowhere would look like. You know, I don't know what a thing in and of itself would be like, because by definition, I can never get at it. And a lot of the discussions about consciousness strike me as trying to get at something with a view from nowhere, and I know I'm just not entirely convinced of that. Having said that, I'm like, you know, I'm perfectly open to being convinced on this point. It's not like I am die hard against this. It's just that I'm concerned that I can't see what would adjudicate the debate between the physicalist who thinks that everything is essentially physical, like separate from any kind of experience of it. It just like also is essentially physical. And the non-physicalist who agrees with the physicalist in all of the observations about the world, but also thinks that everything or the mind is essentially non-physical. I don't know. I kind of don't. But then again, I think it's just that I'm skeptical about this fundamental reality that they're arguing about. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful or if that's just deeply unhelpful, because it's kind of a wishy-washy, sidesteppy answer. But that's why I struggle to engage with the philosophical debates on consciousness in the way that they're often put. Okay, here we have a question from Annika, S4U, and it reads, who's your favorite author just reading style-wise? So separate from content, my favorite author in terms of style. This is a tricky question. Probably either Stendhal, but I suppose then I'm kind of incorporating the particular translation. But at the very least, the Stendhal that I've read in English, read incredibly well. I love the reading style. I thought it was very funny and very witty, and at the same time, incredibly insightful too. I think Stendhal just is an absolute genius. There's also Bulgakov, the author of The Master and the Margarita, who I really like his writing style. Again, in translation, so for what it's worth, I don't know how much that holds, but I think that Bulgakov has a wonderful way of describing things, that he can do the sort of conversational, vernacular way of speaking and writing, I suppose. But at the same time, he's very, very good at describing things that are magical and fantastical. I think that's a real skill as well. And then the third would be P.G. Wodehouse. I think P.G. Wodehouse is the funniest author ever, and I think he's a magnificent stylist, just has a phenomenal way with words, and I would encourage everyone to go read him. I think, I say there's very little philosophy in there. There's quite a lot of like social satire in there, which I think is very good, in kind of the Jeeves and Wooster books, which are the ones I'm most familiar with. But he's just a magnificent prose stylist, and I think that it's so hard to be funny in written text. I think it's so difficult, because I think that I've watched a fair amount of stand-up, and if some of you have, I think you might concur with my observation here, which is that I feel like 70% of what stand-up comics do is they're very, very skilled at getting the audience on side. And if an audience is in a particularly genial mood, you'll notice that a stand-up comic can say almost anything, and the audience will burst out laughing because they're in that kind of rapport. It's similar to how, if you're sat chatting with some friends, right, and you're telling jokes, those jokes can make you laugh more than some of the greatest comedy writing in history, simply because of the context and how relaxed you are. Your mental state is perfectly attuned to humor. But of course, in the written word, which is P.G. Wodehouse's domain, you kind of don't get any of that. You can kind of build up a rapport with your reader as a writer, but it's much harder. And so I think you have to lean a lot more on just being an incredibly skilled stylist. And I think that's what P.G. Wodehouse is. And then fourth, I'd probably say Shakespeare. That's kind of boring, but Shakespeare is as brilliant as everyone says. So I'm sorry to be dull, but I will happily be dull and right. Okay, next we have a question by Ralph NC09, and it reads, what's some advice you would give to someone who wants to use his intellect but takes disagreement a bit too personally, sees everything as a threat? Yeah, it's a bit of a shame. Also, I'm new to most of this. I haven't done rigorous reading on philosophy, literature, arguments on God, existence, etc. So first of all, everyone starts somewhere. Like, it's perfectly okay not to have read all that much on these subjects. Like, if it's something you're interested in, it's just you'll read more over time, right? Everyone begins with not having read everything. Everyone begins with not having read anything, and nobody ends with having read everything. So, you're starting at the same point as everyone else. And like, something that an old philosophy professor of mine used to remind all of us of was that however much you have read, you have only read a vanishing amount of the literature on any topic, probably, and certainly a vanishing amount of literature out there on every relevant topic that you're interested in. It's just that there is an absurd amount of thinking done, an absurd amount of writing done on almost everything that you can think of, and you're never going to encounter it all. So, that's that. Don't let people, talk down to you. We were all at one point very, very new to things. In terms of taking disagreement a bit too personally, I think that's also just kind of something you get used to. I've kind of had a crash course of it, online, right? Because you're just exposed to so many more people, and I don't get very much negative pushback, but like anyone, right? I do get some. And I think that it is something that you become inured to. One thing that I found that really helps is, in philosophy, I think that you get used to not identifying with your own beliefs very much, at the very least in my area of philosophy. It may be different. I know some people who are very into political philosophy who are really, really identify with their beliefs. But certainly in my kind of neck of the woods, philosophically, I suppose, it's common practice to try not to end up identifying with the things you believe. And the reason for that is that you might be wrong. And if you are wrong, you want to be able to change your mind without it hurting all that much. And also you want to make sure that because it would hurt to change your mind isn't kind of marshalling all of its resources to ensure that you don't change your mind, right? Because that's the other worry, is that if we find the possibility that we're wrong very painful, then we will not improve. We'll not maximize our true beliefs, and will not get kind of closer to being well-rounded thinkers. So I don't know, that's one reason to kind of not identify too strongly with your beliefs. And also, like, you'll end up taking disagreement less personally, because it won't seem like it's a reflection on you. It'll just be like, well, people don't share my belief. That's kind of how things go. Another, if you hold a position very, very strongly and you're very frustrated, people are disagreeing with you about that. A phrase that I quite like is just let them be wrong. People are going to be incorrect about things. That's okay. Even if they are straightforwardly, factually incorrect, or you feel very strongly that they are just wrong about something, people are going to be wrong. Like, it's okay. The world isn't going to collapse because people are wrong about things or disagree with you about things. At the very least, that particular person isn't going to bring about the end of the world, probably, unless they have access to nuclear weapons or something. What was the other part of your question? Seeing everything as a threat. Yeah, I think that's. I think that not identifying with your own beliefs and recognizing that they're likely to change a lot over time can be very helpful here. Something that I've mentioned a lot on the channel is that I disagree with a lot of what I believed even a few years ago, and with some topics I disagree with a lot of what I believed a year ago, and with a few I disagree with what I believed even a couple of months ago. So I think once we get used to seeing our beliefs not as a set of things that's going to be fixed and that it is our duty to defend, but instead as one stage along a development, then it becomes much easier to go, well, I could be wrong about this. It's not a threat for it to be wrong. If anything, it's more rewarding to be wrong about something than right about something, because that then allows you to change your mind and have a more defensible and more developed set of beliefs. I think that is, in some ways, it's much better to be wrong than to be right, because when you find out you're wrong, you get to become better. Whereas if you find out you're right, I know you can't go anywhere from there, right? You're right, like, big whoop. You don't get to learn anything from being right. You get to learn quite a lot from being wrong. So I don't know. That's what I tell myself anyway, to kind of stem the shame of realizing that I'm wrong about things. Next, we have a question from Robadarwish 9514, and it reads, do you journal to document your growth over the years? Do you note down your troubles, goals, and ideas for the sake of self-reflection? If so, what's the structure that you go for? So I do journal. I both have like typed notes that I kind of type up if I've got a lot to say, but I also have a handwritten journal that I write in most days, I would say. Sometimes I go long stretches of time without doing kind of personal reflection in it, but I'm always writing something in it. Part of that's just because for a long time I really struggled to handwrite. I had kind of soft tissue damage and stuff down my writing arm, and that made it, difficult to handwrite. And so I take a real pleasure in now being able to handwrite. It's something that I couldn't do very well for a very long time. So that's one reason. I don't really have a structure for my journal. I'm not one of those people that has 5 different journals for different subtopics and things. I just find that whenever I've tried to do that in the past, all that's ended up happening is that I've got overwhelmed and I haven't written in any of them. So I have one journal for everything. If I have kind of thoughts that I feel need to be worked out handwritten on paper, I'll do it in that. It also has my personal reflections in. It has my to-do lists in. It has, stuff I'm working on, video ideas, particular kind of quotes from books that I've enjoyed so much that I wanted to write them down. I just have like one book for everything. That means I go through books fairly quickly. So it's not on this bookshelf, but in the bookshelf in my living room, I have a stack of my old notebooks, which is really fun. Sometimes I go through it and I think, God, what was I thinking this time, last year? And I know kind of which notebook corresponds to that, and I kind of go to that one. I've tried journaling a few different ways. I used to take a lot of notes on my Kindle Scribe. Oh, that's I must be in the other room. That's a Kindle Scribe, by the way. This isn't sponsored or anything, but they are fantastic. They're just brilliant. You get to make notes on the side. You get to highlight. You can export them all off. It's brilliant. So I highly recommend Kindle Scribe. I import PDFs onto it, and I can kind of write right onto the PDF, and then have an annotated version of my PDF. It's brilliant. I'd highly recommend it. So I do a fair amount of my actual note taking in the margins of things. And then, at the end of a chapter or at the end of a book, I tend to then either type up some notes or write a paragraph about it, or jot down a few notes in my notebook. It kind of depends on what kind of is nearest to me in the moment, or what I fancy doing. I'm not precious about things. I don't have a journaling system that I really stick to, or a note taking system that I religiously stick to. I feel like that can be very, very helpful, but after a while, you kind of figure out what works for you. You can loosen up and I don't know, journal in jazz rather than in kind of strict time. Which I know I find that I journal more, and I journal more effectively. I don't know if effectively is the right word. When I just allow myself to kind of do what I want. So that's kind of my broad approach. That is profoundly unhelpful, but it is true. Next, we have a question from Bas van der Veen 9575, and it reads, what topic would you have liked a certain philosopher to tackle? As in, I wonder what philosopher X would have said about topic Y. Like, what would Plato have thought about the modern human rights framework and its philosophical underpinnings, e.g.? So, there are a couple. Two really spring to mind. One is Plato, but Plato on modern mathematics and modern logic, because Plato was obsessed with mathematics. He was obsessed with geometry, and in his educational system for the philosopher kings, there's a huge amount of what we would now call pretty abstract mathematics. So I'd love to see what Plato would make of harmonics and modern algebra and group theory and symmetries and topology and all sorts. I just think that'd be really interesting. How would he have reacted? Would that have affected his philosophical framework? Would it have not changed it at all? Would it have made it more entrenched? How would he react to the modern philosophy of mathematics? Would he recognize modern Platonism, or would he think, I don't know about that. Actually, I intended Platonism to be a bit different from how it's currently worked out. So that's one thing. I'd really like to see what Plato would make of mathematics and the philosophy around mathematics, and also modern logic, because of course Plato wrote before Aristotle even made the first steps to codifying logic, and I would love to see what Plato would think of that, and what Aristotle would think of that, and what the Stoic logicians would think of that, like Chrysippus. I'd love to see what Chrysippus would make of Begriffsschrift, Frege's Begriffsschrift, or something like that. I think that'd be really cool. The other one that really springs to mind is I'd love to see how Nietzsche would react to modern neuroscience and modern evolutionary biology, and kind of modern empirical psychology more generally. One of the things that's really kind of affected the way that I read Nietzsche, especially more recently, because it's kind of been the stuff that I'm reading, has been looking at the books that Nietzsche himself was reading at the time. Thomas Brobjer, just generally, he's a Nietzsche scholar from Sweden, and he, in his papers and in his books, is so on it with this. And it has really changed the way that I see Nietzsche. Because, we think of Nietzsche as an untimely thinker. And he refers to himself as an untimely thinker. A philosopher who is commenting on perennial themes to a certain extent. And somebody who is, in his view, not mired in the particular controversies of his day. However, if we look at what Nietzsche's reading, especially in his later periods, Nietzsche was reading a lot of contemporary psychology, a lot of contemporary biology, a lot of very, very, very early neuroscience. And I don't know, I think that these seem to have shaped his thinking in pretty important and profound ways. Because especially in his later work, he's often prioritizing the physiological over what we might call the kind of psychological, even though he thinks that the physiological has psychological implications. So it gets complicated. But I think that Nietzsche would take an awful lot from the modern states of those fields, and I would be very interested in seeing how they shaped his own thinking. I think that also, just generally, I think it's really worth looking into the context of his thoughts. Let me bring up my book. It's by Brobjer. It is on... I'm trying to get the exact title. It's called Nietzsche's Philosophical Context and Intellectual Biography. We read a Brobjer book as part of the reading group was it March? No, it was April. In April. In March, we read Simone Weil. And this, in that book, he talks a lot about Nietzsche's context around what he was reading when he wrote Twilight of the Idols. But in this book, that's just called Nietzsche's Philosophical Context, he just examines the books that Nietzsche's reading at various different points in his writing period. For example, one of the things I took from this, I didn't realize this, was that in his middle period, Nietzsche was reading so much Voltaire. I didn't know that. Like, I knew that Nietzsche had some positive things to say about Voltaire, but I didn't realize quite how influential that was in his middle period. And in his later period, he's reading so much contemporary natural science. I think that it's very easy to overlook this sort of thing. I also didn't realize, this is something else that I learned from this book, is that in his later period, in his very late period, he had an ongoing correspondence with Ernst Mach, the kind of Vienna Circle philosopher. Amazing, right? I would have never drawn that connection, but they exchanged letters. Nietzsche sent him a copy of The Genealogy of Morals. But anyway, I think that kind of thing's fascinating. And so, yeah, I would love to see, knowing that and knowing how influenced Nietzsche was by his own contemporary physiological sciences and evolutionary biology, like as a kind of overarching framework and things like that, I would be just so fascinated to see how he would react to the advanced, mature state of those fields today. I think that would be completely brilliant. And I want to know how much that would change his view on things. Would it mean that he would go back and re-clarify some of his ideas about psychology, or would he view them as confirming some of his ideas about psychology? Brian Leiter wrote a book called Nietzsche's Moral Psychology, or something like that. It's either called Nietzsche's Moral Psychology or Moral Psychology with Nietzsche. It's like one of those. So many of the titles of these commentaries kind of blur into one in my head. But anyway, in the final chapter of that book, he talks about modern empirical evidence for his interpretation of Nietzsche's psychological framework. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And so, yeah, I think that's the kind of thing that Nietzsche himself would be interested in. And so, that's an example of a philosopher who I would be so fascinated to wake up today and see how far neuroscience and physiology and psychology have come in the past 100 or so years, and just see what he makes of it. I don't know what he would make of it, but I would love to find out. Sadly, of course, we never will. Sorry, I ran out of contacts this morning, so I'm going to be in my glasses for the next few. And our next question is from IDILAAT1I. And it reads, really wanted to ask, did you like philosophy as a kid? Were you ever told to stop talking about it or to be less philosophical? How do you fare in social situations in general? I fare all right. I wasn't a particularly social kid. I was certainly very interested in asking like incredibly strange questions. I was very confused with the way people use language from a very, very young age. I kind of thought this seems very odd. I would notice that people would use the same words in different ways, and thus they would end up having arguments even though they weren't really disagreeing on anything. And I generally saw that people would get mired in linguistic disputes when they were trying to talk about something more substantive. And that's kind of how I got into philosophy. I got into philosophy largely through confusions about language. Like I started my philosophical reading with philosophy of language largely, and I just kind of expanded outwards from there. I suppose the kind of, like, there are early stories reportedly from my parents. Like, apparently I was like a pain in the ass in Sunday school and stuff. In fact, I was embarrassed of this story, so I used to attribute it to a friend, but it actually was me, younger at Sunday school, who bothered the nice young lady running it, who looked very old when I was 7, but was probably like 15, and asked her why, if you go to heaven when you've just been baptized, why wasn't I killed after baptism? Because then I would never risk going to hell, and that would be, hell sounds really, really bad. So, if my parents truly loved me, why didn't they kill me post baptism? So I had that kind of question, which I don't feel is too unusual. I think that one of the reasons why I've got young cousins and young family friends, and I think one of the reasons why I kind of enjoyed spending time with them almost and chatting with them is because I think kids are quite natural philosophers, because they kind of just haven't learnt what questions aren't silly to ask. Sorry, what questions aren't okay to ask, if that makes sense. Like, nobody's told them, hopefully, yet, that these questions are like nonsensical or pointless or whatever. And I think that obviously is why kids also ask a lot of questions that don't have any like feasible answer and are kind of linguistically malformed. But it also sometimes means that they would just pose philosophical questions just kind of out of the blue. I remember I was chatting to a family friend of mine when she was like 6, so like a couple of years ago now. And she said, "Uncle Joe," and I said, "Yes." And she said, "Where did beauty come from?" And I was like, that's like an insane thing for a small child to ask. And yeah, it didn't strike her as a particularly strange question. I kind of said, well, it sort of depends who you ask. And we had a bit of a back and forth, about what she thinks beautiful means and what kind of things she thinks are beautiful and why. And it was really, really kind of interesting. And I think that a lot of the time, kids just are quite philosophical. So I don't think that like a philosophically inclined kid is particularly unusual. I think that, my parents were always very good at kind of nurturing my curiosity in that direction and in loads of other directions. I was a really curious kid. I would just annoy them constantly with questions on everything. So I kind of think that, yeah, I was a very questioning kid, sometimes probably to the detriment of everyone else around me. Then again, I don't know how much of that has changed. In social situations, I wasn't a particularly socially skilled kid. I kind of taught myself how to socialize by looking at the people around me. When I was quite little, I had like a notebook and I would write little observations about what other people did and to kind of like suss out what it is that, makes people react certain ways to certain things. And like eventually that kind of gave way to a much more natural way of engaging with the world. I don't have to think like that in quite the same way. But yeah, no, I struggled with socializing quite a lot as a kid. But again, I don't think that's massively unusual. Like loads of kids struggle with socializing. So I think that, that kind of, but yeah, no. But to answer your question, I wasn't a massively socially skilled kid, but I was also very bookish. So I think to a certain extent, like I was not social because of a lack of interest until very suddenly I was interested in socialization and making friends. And then I kind of had to catch up because all the kids who'd shown interest in socialization had already put that work in. And so I had to kind of suddenly bootstrap my way into being like a reasonably competent conversationalist. But that was fun, it's kind of a nice little project for little me. Okay, our next question is from MatrixBoy303, and it reads, "You and Alex have found the greatest philosopher of all time." We ended up settling on Aristotle, which I think is a fairly uncontroversial choice. I know in some ways finding the greatest of anything of all time, there tends to be a sort of convergence, like greatest drummer, people tend to converge on Neil Peart. Greatest guitarist, people tend to converge on Jimi Hendrix. And greatest philosopher, I think people tend to converge on Aristotle or Plato. It's kind of those are the ones that people tend to converge on. I bet I've just like pissed off loads of people who are really into rock. But at the very least, that's my impression from watching conversations. And also, I'm a big Rush fan, so that's why I'm very sympathetic to the crowning of Neil Peart as the greatest drummer of all time. But anyway, who is, in your opinion, and as far as we can tell, the smartest recorded person in philosophy? That's a very, very good question. Now, I am really biased here, so I think Frank Ramsey. Frank Ramsey's amazingly brilliant. I've got his biography up here. It's by Cheryl Mizak, who's a phenomenal philosopher and historian of philosophy. But the subtitle to it is A Sheer Excess of Powers. This is one of those books where I've actually got it in ebook, and that's the one that I mainly read because it's nice to have it on the go. But I was so enamored with it that I got the physical book because it's just like lovely to have. But anyway, no, Frank Ramsey would be the person that I would say is at least in the running for the smartest philosophy person or philosopher of all time. He kind of just went around, like, I think part of it's the fact he died so young. So he died, oh my God, he died when he was not much older than me. And by the time he died, he revolutionized, whole areas of mathematics, huge areas of philosophy, a few areas of economics. Just a bastard, you come across these people in history who are so intelligent, you just go, fuck you, man, what a dick, you're hoarding all of the brains to yourself. And the other reason why I really admire Frank Ramsey, as well as the fact he was so like incredibly brilliant, just seemed to be able to originate these original and incredibly insightful ways of looking at philosophical problems. He originated a huge aspect of the theory of partial beliefs and credences and how to treat those in the philosophy of probability and stuff like that. As well as that, he was just a lovely, lovely guy. He was one of the only people that Wittgenstein would consult on things. Like, Wittgenstein really valued his opinion. And Wittgenstein's another contender for an incredibly clever person. The reason why I would go for Frank Ramsey, and I realize this is just showing my own bias more than anything else, is because he, I think, more than any other thinker in history, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, disproves the idea that in order to be really clever, you need to be a dick. Like, we have this idea, I think, culturally floating around in characters like, I don't know, Sherlock Holmes, not necessarily the book Sherlock Holmes, but almost every adaptation of Sherlock Holmes that I've seen, like, you know, Dr. House and that kind of stuff. We have this kind of cultural idea of the person who is a genius and their genius makes them kind of an asshole, you know? And Frank Ramsey was like the opposite of that. And I love that because he was potentially the cleverest person in Cambridge at the time where he lived and worked there. And yet he was so lovely. You know, he would ask, he said, he would like ask people questions. He wouldn't condescend to them. He seemed to want to learn something from all the people around him. And I just love that. I think that's such a wonderful approach to life and to study. And I think that I wish that culturally in philosophy and in other fields, we replaced the kind of giant of Wittgenstein as an intellect to emulate. Because Wittgenstein was a genius, no doubt about it. But I wish that we replaced him as an idol, almost, with Frank Ramsey, because Frank Ramsey demonstrates so well that the kind of genius and dickishness can come apart, and actually you can have someone who is, I would argue, just as, if not more clever than Wittgenstein, and yet was eminently kind to the people around him. That's why I love Frank Ramsey. And I'm sure I've given that rant on the channel before, just because I love talking about him. He's phenomenal. I'll link some of his papers in the description if I can remember, because they're free online and they're just amazing. Sorry, I'm going to kind of, I'll get too sidetracked and I'll start just making rather odd noises if I continue talking about Frank Ramsey, so I'm going to move on. But please do check out his papers, because that would be my contender for the most intelligent person I've ever read about in philosophy. And you can make the case for many other people, but that's the one. You know, that's my gut instinct. Here we have a question from Feral Earthman. That's a cool name. And it reads, what do you think about Byung-Chul Han? I really like Byung-Chul Han. I think that he has an incredible ability to put his finger on how people feel, if that makes sense. So, like, the Burnout Society was a bestseller, I think, for a very understandable and good reason, which is that he's so good at describing and conceptualizing a framework to process everyday phenomena that people experience, like burnout. You know, when he says in the Burnout Society that burnout is a result of a kind of auto-exploitative cycle that you put yourself through even when no one else is watching. I think that myself, and I know that I read that and thought, Christ, that's very insightful. Yes, I think that does hit on something. And I think many other people felt the same. And I think that's kind of what Byung-Chul Han is brilliant at. I think that's one of the reasons why people find him so compelling. I am reading a book by Byung-Chul Han at the moment, actually, called In the Swarm, which is about... It's about many things, because Byung-Chul Han books kind of always are, even when they pretend to be about one thing, they're about many things. But it's ostensibly about kind of the way that we do discourse on the internet, because that's a kind of video topic that I'm working on at the moment, and it's kind of almost ready to record. So I'm quite excited about that. But where was I going with this? Yes. But I think there it has a very similar vibe to it, I suppose. It has a very similar strength to it. Like, when he's talking about the way that discourse online is fleeting and it has no staying power, but at the same time it's kind of chaotic and powerful and seemingly like unpredictable and lashes out, but it's also not like one coherent body acting. It's kind of many different things arising and falling away in this kind of to create a state of discourse where it feels like there's no stable handholds to grip. I think that genuinely is such a good description of how it feels to conduct dialogue in many places on the internet, especially kind of mass social media platforms like Twitter. So yeah, I think that is his like immense strength as a philosopher. I wish he wrote a bit clearer sometimes, but I suppose, I feel like most people have that complaint about Han when they read him. And I do think that part of the reason why he is so compelling is that he puts things in a very poetic way, at least in translation, right? Because I've not read him in German. And so maybe that is, maybe his writing would be poorer were it more like a kind of analytic philosophy paper. Yeah, I don't know. That would be my my general thoughts. The other thing that I do kind of wish is that I wish that he would occasionally make it explicit what he's drawing upon sometimes, because sometimes he does. Sometimes, like, there's a chapter in the Burnout Society where he's just commenting on an essay by Walter Benjamin, and that's fantastic. So you can bring up the essay by Walter Benjamin, you can read them side by side, and that makes everything a whole lot easier. Occasionally, he is referencing things slightly obscurely, like it's not entirely clear exactly what he's referencing, and then you don't get to do the side-by-side comparison and see and read what he's commenting on as he's commenting on it. Sometimes you can, but sometimes it's a bit more difficult to find. So that's something that I find a bit difficult. I also think that I know this is both a strength and a weakness. I find I can only read Byung-Chul Han in very small chunks, and I think that's actually partly because his writing is very rich and takes a long time to pick through. And that's I like that. I can see why it frustrates some people, though. Some people really don't like Byung-Chul Han. I've met people who just go, yeah, I hate him, man. I just think, I don't know, I can't imagine hating him. But yeah, I see why people also have critiques of his work. I like to see his work primarily as constructing conceptual frameworks to understand the phenomenology of modern life from the inside. That's how I interpret it. And in that, I think it's incredibly helpful. But, other people may disagree. I'm not, I'm sure that there are good critiques of him as well. Here we have a question from Too Aware for This, and it reads, will you do videos about logic? Yes, I will. I know I keep saying that I will, and I will. I think that I've done a couple, I did a video where I was very skeptical about the way that we use the word logical fallacy and stuff like that. The trouble is that a lot of logic is almost impossible to talk about without just doing the symbols. And the trouble with that is that, it's impossible within the span of a 40-minute to an hour YouTube video to become familiar enough with logical symbolization to talk about it in depth. I could do a guide, I could do a kind of, here's how logical symbolization works. But then, at the end of the hour, we wouldn't have really got any further than just establishing the kind of symbolism, maybe we'll get as far as what a simple natural deduction and propositional logic is. So it's just very tricky. It's very tricky to, well, and then if you talk about logic without the symbols, it's very easy to just stick entirely on the surface because so much of formal logic is the symbols and it's impossible to express without the symbols. There are a couple of videos that I want to do on logic. Well, there are three. I thought about doing a video on, that scene in the BBC Sherlock show where it's become a kind of a meme online where Sherlock says, you struggle, there are scratches around the charging port of your phone, so I know that you were gifted this by your alcoholic brother, or I can't remember the exact thing. But anyway, I thought I could use scenes like that and to kind of illustrate the difference between deduction, induction, and abduction, and the necessary components of a good argument within each of those. I still may do that. I think that could be quite fun. I'd like to do a video on the proof that 1 + 1 = 2 from the Principia Mathematica, partly because I have it. I have volume 1 of the Principia Mathematica, and I have read up to that point, but I did it when I was 19, 20, so I will need to refamiliarize myself with it. But the nice thing about that particular proof is that you can kind of explain it in plain English, although you will inevitably miss out some stuff. And there are loads of videos online that are the 300-page proof that 1 + 1 = 2, but they don't go into very much detail on what the actual proof is. So I thought, maybe everyone will find this really, really boring. because I'm always very. It's quite because I really like logic, and although I don't do it nearly as much as I used to, I still like it. It used to be like my joy. I have a tendency to overestimate the extent to which people will care about any of it. But I want to do a video on Gödel's incompleteness theorems. I actually wrote half a video on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and I sort of realized that I was about 3,000 words in, and I kind of hadn't even really explained what the proof was. And I wanted it to be a video not just on the theorem or theorems, but I was just focusing on the first one for the sake of that bit. And then also looking at the way in which the Gödel's incompleteness theorems as results are often misused in various areas of philosophy, but also in science. Actually, even by incredibly bright people. Like Stephen Hawking makes reference to Gödel's incompleteness theorem in one passage of one of his books that's referenced in a book about misconceptions around Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And, Stephen Hawking is obviously like an infinitely better mathematician than I am, and than was, than almost all of the world is. I'm getting confused with the tense because obviously he's dead. Well, anyway, my point is he's very, very good at maths, or was very good at maths. And yet, even he, for whom Gödel's incompleteness theorem would be like the kind of thing that he could pick up and understand without effort, even he ends up parroting some of these mistakes, which I think is very interesting. So I would like to do a video on that. I would still like to do a video on that. I just need to figure out how to frame it, I suppose. This happens a lot. Oftentimes I'll come up with a video idea and then I'll kind of get 80% of the way there and then it won't quite click together, and so I'll just shelve it, and then 8 months later it will hit me and I'll go, great, I kind of know I know how this is going to all slot together there. And so whenever that moment happens, hopefully, if it happens, you will get a video on that. But yes, no, I do want to do more videos on logic if I can. I just need to think about how to go about it, because I don't want to neglect the symbolism, but I also don't the symbolism. It's just it's funny hearing the double meaning of that word. I don't want to neglect the formalism, let's say, instead of symbolism, of formal logic. And at the same time, I don't want to get so lost in that it becomes unhelpfully formal. And cutting that balance is something I will struggle with. So I don't know. We'll see. But I would like to. Yes, that's my broad answer is yes, I would like to. Here we have a question from friend of the channel, Brandon, who runs the YouTube channel Mindshift, which is a really cool channel. Everyone should go check it out. Does lots of content on kind of philosophy of religion and counter-apologetics and that kind of thing. It really, really cool stuff. And it reads, holy cow, congrats, man. Oh, thank you. We did our episode together when you were at 200K. Proud of you. Oh, thanks very much. What's the most surprising philosophical take you've changed your mind on since starting the channel? Oh, I don't know. I've changed my mind on a fair few things since starting the channel. Some of which I've talked about and some which I haven't. I changed my mind a lot on interpretations of stuff. I've certainly changed my mind on how I interpret Nietzsche, and I've changed my mind on how I interpret Schopenhauer a fair amount. And there are aspects of Dostoevsky I've changed my mind on as well, that I think has remained a bit more consistent. Yes, mainly interpretive questions I've changed my mind on a lot since starting the channel, just because I spend a lot of time reading secondary literature on these thinkers and reading the thinkers themselves. And so inevitably there's going to be shifts when you encounter them again and you have fresh thoughts in your mind. I've become probably a bit more empiricist since I started the channel, not in the kind of classical sense, just in terms of wanting to take philosophy a little bit away from intuitive appeals and trying to draw on naturalistic findings wherever I can, though it's not always possible, and generally trying to avoid, except in ethics, because I think it is unavoidable there, but that's why I have an anti-realist conception of ethics, appealing to kind of intuitiveness or intuition as much to uphold my philosophical argumentation, because I've become pretty convinced that I just don't quite know what's supporting it. So that's a big change that has occurred. It was a kind of direction I was already heading in anyway, but that might sound minor, but it is that does underpin an awful lot of philosophical debate. So it ends up being quite a major change. I've become more pragmatist. I was always pretty pragmatist, but I've become like pragmatist in the philosophical sense. I've read a lot of Peirce and Peirce. Sorry, I said Peirce. I said Peirce because one of my professors said Peirce, and I just kind of picked it up. But it is pronounced Peirce. But Charles Sanders Peirce and Frank Ramsey as well. Those two have been very, very influential on me. I mentioned Ramsey earlier, and I just think he's brilliant. Peirce is brilliant as well. So that's been something that I've changed my mind on. I've just kind of drifted more towards that camp over time. I'm actually going to do a video on Wittgenstein and one of my favorite kind of pragmatist leaning interpretations of Wittgenstein, because I think that'll be really interesting. And also, Keegan from Essential Salts did 2 videos on Wittgenstein, and I was like, oh my god, I want to talk about Paul Horwich's interpretation of Wittgenstein. That'll be really fun. So I've kind of just finished refreshing my memory of that, and I will write a video on that pretty shortly. I'm really looking forward to that, because I think Wittgenstein is fascinating, but he's so complicated and there's so many interpretive disputes that I quite like to see him through the eyes of a particular thinker. And this is Paul Horwich's reading of Philosophical Investigations, and that's something I've changed my mind on, actually. Reading that, I read that in the autumn of 2025, and that really changed how I see Wittgenstein. So that was really cool. Yes, there's lots that I've changed my mind on. It tends to be kind of background stuff. There's also stuff that I've gone back and forth on. So for a while, I was more convinced of the strength of the fine-tuning argument, and then I wasn't again. So I don't know. There's other stuff I've gone back and forth on. Probably the biggest shift that occurred just before I kind of started the channel is that when I was at university and when I was an undergrad, I was very fixed into a particular mode of doing philosophy, whereby if something couldn't be fit into a formalism or, a neat kind of logical, or at the very least kind of pseudo-logical structure, I would be incredibly skeptical of it. And I still think that's not a bad instinct, but I am much more open to alternative ways of presenting and doing philosophy, because I've become convinced that even though they offer something different, I don't think it's anything less valuable. I've spent a lot of time in the past few years reading various continental thinkers, and I just think that they're good. I think they have insights to impart. I definitely fall on the continental defenders side, even though my background is more in analytic philosophy, and I still spend a lot of time reading analytic philosophy. So that would be something I've changed my mind on. But again, that's kind of slightly before I started the channel. I changed my mind on a lot of minor things, and then when I look back on it, my positions have changed really significantly. Oh, something I have changed my mind on since starting the channel is that this is kind of quite controversial, I don't think the problem of evil is a problem for the theist. I just think that they can appeal to a certain level of inscrutability in the personality of God. I think that kind of is the traditional theist response. It's certainly the response that is sort of intimated at the end of the Book of Job. So yeah, that's something I changed my mind on. I used to be a very big problem of evil believer, I guess, and now I just don't think it works. And divine hiddenness is slightly different. I actually think divine hiddenness is a better the problem of evil, for reasons that I won't go into now, but maybe I'll write on that at some point, because on the face of it, that does seem a bit peculiar now I'm saying it out loud, but I do have my reasons. That's a few examples, I suppose, but the problem of evil is probably the kind of sexiest issue on which I've kind of over time taken a much more controversial position on. That would be the one, I think. Here's a question from Stephen Adams 9173, and it reads, what's one thing that really makes you angry, grinds your gears? And on the other hand, how do you keep your composure and stay calm and eloquent so well? I'm very flattered you think I'm eloquent. I actually think I'm quite rambly. But I know, I have quite a calm demeanor, I suppose. There were points in my teenage years where I got quite hot-headed, but I think that's relatively normal for a teenager. I don't know. I'm not of a disposition where I am massively bothered by kind of people saying mean things to me or stuff like that. I touched on this earlier. I think that's partly just because the internet is kind of exposure therapy for that. People are going to say mean things, and it's kind of just how it is. Like, I don't think that there are various different strategies that I use to stay calm. Quite a lot of the time is that I'm not. It sounds bad when I say it out loud. I'm not like enormously concerned with what other people think about issues, and that's not because I think that they're like wrong, or necessarily wrong. It's just because I don't know. I have a fair amount of faith in people, I suppose. So when somebody takes a position that disagrees with mine, even if they're very kind of vehement and quite rude about it, I tend to think, well, we just disagree, right? There's nothing particularly mysterious about disagreement, and provided that they're like relatively good faith, and even if they're not good faith, it's just kind of there's nothing. I don't know, maybe it's just there's nothing you can do about it. So like, it just doesn't really bother me. Also, like, the thing about the internet is that like it kind of doesn't matter if people say mean things about you. Like nothing happens. Nobody shows up at my house. I don't spend a lot of time online outside of making videos. And I watch not very much YouTube and basically no philosophy YouTube. The only channel that I will watch, well, there are a couple of channels that I watch with regularity. Like I'll quite often listen to the Nietzsche podcast because I think Keegan always does really, really cool work. And I will, I'll listen to the podcasts of my friends primarily. But that kind of feels slightly different, partly because mostly I listen to that on Spotify. So I'm still not kind of plugged into the YouTube sphere. And also just because, I don't know. So I'm not like, I don't spend a lot of time online, so I don't encounter many things that make me absurdly angry. I occasionally encounter a phrase that will make me very angry. I wrote on my Substack a while ago about the phrase, the idea of fulfilling your potential and how that kind of grinds my gears a bit. Maybe I'll do a full video on that at some point, because I do think it's actually very interesting. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, actually, this is really interesting. I want to write more on this. So maybe I will. Maybe I'll write a bit on that. That's something that grinds my gears. But yeah, no, I don't know how I stay calm particularly. People are mostly very nice. So that kind of helps. And also, yeah, the internet is real life, but most of the time it's not real life. Like there are real disjuncts between internet world and real world. And I know I place a lot of emphasis on just double checking that all of my basic needs are met. Am I seeing people? I have a roof over my head. I have food on the table. It's just kind of fine. I know, maybe that's, I don't think that's particularly unusual. But that might be it. I'm also saying I see my family a lot. I'm very close to my family. I live near to them. I see my siblings a lot. So I know, I just kind of, I feel like when you're in a very, very natural social support network, the idea of like people being mean to you online hits much, much less, because it seems so ephemeral and insignificant compared to like the genuine embodied affection of your own family. So I don't know, that might be why. But also like people just aren't very mean to me online. Most people are very kind of nice. I find that if you're nice to people, people will be nice to you back. So I know I kind of live by that, I guess. Here we have a question by Gordon Shumway, 1857, and it reads, should philosophers have beards? Does stroking a beard produce better thoughts or reflections? I don't know. I can't grow a beard. I wish I could. I would so grow a beard. I will grow a beard the minute that I can grow one. Like this is like, 2 days stubble, and you can see it's just kind of patchy and rubbish. I can't grow a big, wonderful Daniel Dennett-esque bushy beard, but I would love to. There's an old Latin phrase that is, I can't remember what it is in Latin, but in English it's the beard doesn't make the philosopher, and it's kind of on this. Well, it's a kind of more general lesson about somebody can look like something without being them. The philosophers, or the classic stereotype of philosopher, has a beard, but the beard isn't the thing that makes them the philosopher. It's kind of, it's not causative there. And yes, don't be fooled by the appearance, I suppose is the lesson of that phrase. But no, that's struck me as a kind of odd bit of synchronicity between that and this comment. Should philosophers have beards? I know, I say I want a beard. I can't give a kind of moral proclamation on the matter, but I would want a beard. Does stroking a beard produce better thoughts or reflections? I do fiddle a lot when I think, either with my beard or with my hands, or like I drum on tables. In my chat with Jonathan Pajot, you can see me drumming on the chair with my fingers, and I do that a lot when I think. I like tap, which I think is a habit I got from my dad, because he taps on lots of things when he's thinking. So yeah, maybe that's maybe that's my version of stroking a beard. I do find that like fidgeting or pacing helps me think a little bit better if I'm a bit antsy. So I don't know. So when I have a beard, I think I will stroke it. I'll enjoy that. But for now, I'll have to make do with my sad alternatives to beard stroking. Right, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much again for all the support. I really am bowled over by it. I can't believe that, I started this channel like 3 years ago, and I'm completely blown away by how enthused people have been with it, and how enthusiastic people are about philosophy and literature. It's such an absolute privilege to be able to do this. If you want to watch the last Q&A, you can watch it here. I talk about various different stuff. I've tried to make sure that I cover different topics here that I covered there. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.